The cold came early that morning, sharper than a knife honed on stone. Frost clung to the brittle grass, and every exhale from Silas Rourke's mouth rolled into the dim air like pale smoke. He'd been up since before first light, checking the northern fence line, his boots crunching on frozen earth, the sound loud in the stillness. The world felt hollow and brittle, like one hard kick could shatter it into 1,000 shards. The sun was no more than a weak smudge behind a bank of pale clouds when he spotted movement by the eastern fence. At first, he thought it was one of his yearlings that had strayed, a small shape hunched near the posts. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something human, a woman folded against the frost-hardened ground as if she'd been dropped there. Silas's stride slowed. Out here, in the empty miles between settlements, a body could mean trouble. He'd buried enough of them to know. His hand brushed the butt of the Colt on his hip out of habit, scanning the horizon for any other movement. Nothing but open plain, the occasional swirl of dust, and the far-off whisper of wind through dry sage. When he knelt beside her, he realized she was young, perhaps 20 at most, and shivering violently in the raw cold. Her skin had the warm bronze hue of the desert tribes, but her lips were blue, her breaths shallow. A thin cotton dress clung to her like damp paper, and he could see where the fabric had been torn by brush or worse. There was no coat, no blanket, only the long black braid trailing over her shoulder and the faint outline of frost on her hair. "Ma'am," he said quietly, testing her awareness. Her eyelids fluttered, but no words came, just a low sound that might have been pain. When she shifted, he saw the dark stain along her left thigh, half-frozen blood crusting over a gash deep enough to kill if left untended. Silas had never been one to think long on a decision when life was in the balance. The coat came off his shoulders in one motion, heavy sheepskin lined with wool, and he wrapped it around her small frame. She was light, far too light for a grown woman, and he lifted her without strain. Her head lolled against his chest, and the faint smell of wood smoke clung to her hair, as if she'd been near a fire recently, then driven away from it. The walk back to the ranch house was slow and steady. The boards of the porch groaned beneath his boots, and the front door swung open to release a wash of warmer air. He carried her past the rough-hewn table, past the stone hearth where a meager fire burned, straight into the back room where the light was soft and the bed was clean. Laying her down, Silas eased the coat away and checked the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the skin around it was angry and swollen. Whoever she was, she'd been running for more than a day, and every step had driven grit into the cut. He cleaned it as best he could with boiled water and a strip of cloth, working in silence except for the crackle of the fire in the next room. When he tried to ask her name again, her eyes opened just enough to reveal a flash of dark brown irises, sharp, intelligent, but dulled now by exhaustion. She said something in a tongue he didn't know, the syllables low and musical, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Silas stood there for a long moment, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Bringing her inside was one thing. Keeping her here, that was another matter. If she'd been attacked, the ones who'd done it might not be far, and if she was Apache, Comanche, or from any other tribe in these parts, he might be inviting a different kind of trouble altogether. He moved to the window. The frost was thick on the glass, but through it he could see the eastern ridges, low and bare this time of year. A hawk wheeled high above, and in the far distance, a faint plume of dust curled lazily into the sky. Could be nothing, could be everything. By mid-morning, the fire in the hearth was throwing a decent heat, and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Silas poured himself a cup, his eyes never leaving the window. He'd fed her a little broth before she drifted back to sleep, and the color in her cheeks had improved slightly. Still, she was too quiet, too still. That was when he saw it, clear tracks coming from the southeast, cutting across the frozen ground toward his land. The prints were fresh, pressed deep by horses moving at a steady trot. His grip tightened around the mug, tracks heading straight toward his ranch, ending somewhere beyond the small rise near the creek. He set the coffee aside, pulled on his hat, and stepped onto the porch. The wind was biting, but it carried sound well, and after a moment he heard the faint creak of saddle leather. Riders. Silas eased back inside, his boots silent on the worn planks. In the back room, the woman stirred faintly, a crease of pain forming between her brows even in sleep. He knelt beside her. "Someone's coming," he said, not expecting her to respond. But her eyes opened suddenly, and this time he saw the sharpness there, the awareness. She reached for his arm with surprising strength, her fingers curling around his wrist like iron. "Hide," she whispered, her voice rough from cold and disuse. Then she shook her head, glancing toward the door, urgency written plain on her face. "No time. They will see." Silas didn't ask who they were. He'd been on the frontier long enough to know the look of hunted prey. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, the rhythm echoing off the frozen ground. He could make out at least 3 horses now, maybe 4, approaching in a loose formation. Whoever they weren't in a hurry to announce themselves. Her grip tightened again, and this time she said something in English, the words barely audible. "Don't tell them who I am." Before he could answer, the first shadow passed across the porch, followed by the heavy thump of boots hitting the ground. A man's voice, deep and edged with authority, called out from the front. "Mornin' to you, Rourke. We're looking for someone. Came through here not long ago, I reckon." Silas rose slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He glanced back at the bed. She'd pulled the coat tight around herself, eyes wide, listening. The man outside spoke again, closer this time. "Woman, Indian. Might be hurt. You seen her?" Silas's hand brushed the door frame. "Can't say that I have," he replied, his voice calm, measured, the way a man spoke when every word had to land just right. There was a pause, long enough for the wind to whisper between them. Then came the scrape of boots on wood as the man stepped onto the porch fully. "Mind if we take a look around?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "Depends on who's asking. And why." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that could tilt into violence with the smallest push. Somewhere behind him, the bed creaked as she shifted again, the sound almost lost beneath the whistle of the wind. He stepped forward, filling the doorway, his shadow stretching across the porch. "You'd best tell me your business straight, stranger. I don't take kindly to folk riding up uninvited." The rider's eyes, cold and sharp, met his. "Then you're not gonna like what comes next." And just like that, the morning felt colder than the frost on the grass, the air between them tight as a drawn bowstring. The man on the porch didn't blink, didn't shift his weight. His boots were planted like stakes in the boards, his hands hanging loose by his sides, too loose. Men who looked that easy were usually the quickest to draw. Behind him, the other riders kept their positions just off the porch, their breath steaming in the cold. They were watching Silas's face as much as they were watching the door, measuring the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his voice. The one on the left had the pinched expression of a hired tracker, eyes darting to every patch of churned dirt. "I'll tell you again," Silas said, voice low. "You best explain your business before you go sniffing around mine." The latter's mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Name's Price, territorial deputy. We've got reason to believe a dangerous fugitive came through here. Native woman, might be bleedin', might be desperate." Silas kept his expression neutral. "You got papers to prove your law?" Price tilted his head. "Don't need papers to ride for justice." That told Silas enough. These weren't badge men, not in any sense that mattered. Deputies carried writs. Posse riders with a grudge carried stories about justice and expected you to nod along. From inside the back room came the faintest sound, fabric whispering against fabric, the mattress groaning under a shift of weight. Price's gaze flicked past Silas toward the dark interior of the house. "Mind if we step inside?" Silas's hand settled against the doorframe. "I do mind." The silence that followed was taut. Somewhere out in the yard, a horse stamped impatiently, the sound echoing off the cold ground. Price took a half-step closer, his shadow falling over Silas's boots. "You see anyone cross your land this morning?" "No." "You been out on the east fence?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The deputy's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because we cut sign there. Tracks from a woman's feet. Light, but hurried. Cut across your property and vanished near that rise by the creek. Funny thing, though, those tracks stop, but we don't see where they start again." Silas didn't look away. Ground out there's full of tricks this time of year. Frost, melt, frost again. Sign disappears. Price studied him for another long moment, then turned toward his men. "We'll sweep the outbuildings, just to be sure." The two riders dismounted, moving toward the barn. Silas stayed in the doorway, watching their boots sink into the frost. "Stay out of my hayloft," he called after them, "and keep your hands off anything that doesn't belong to you." Price leaned a shoulder against the porch post, eyes scanning the yard. "She's worth a lot to the right people, Rourke. Folks in town might tell you she's just another runaway. They'd be wrong." Silas kept his voice even. "That's so. She's the chief's daughter, from the high country. Her people been stiff-necked for years, won't sign the land papers, but you take the chief's blood, and you got leverage. You take his daughter, and you own his hand." It was said lightly, but Silas heard the weight behind it. He also saw the way Price's eyes lingered on the door behind him, calculating. From the back room, the woman's breathing quickened. He could hear it now, faint but uneven. Her father's daughter. That explained the bearing in her eyes, the way she met his gaze earlier, despite her pain. Price adjusted his coat collar against the wind. "Thing about this kind of work, you get paid twice. Once for bringing her in, and once for what comes after. Her people get quiet real fast when they know she's under someone's roof they can't reach." Silas felt something cold coil in his gut. The words weren't just business. They were cruelty laid bare. The barn doors creaked open. One of the riders stuck his head out. Empty. Price sighed, straightening. "All right. We'll be back through if the sign picks up again. Maybe she circled wide. Maybe she's already dead out there." He put his boot in the stirrup, then paused to glance back at Silas. "If she comes through, you'd be smart to send word. Men like me can do things to keep a man's life simple. Men who cross us, well, life gets complicated fast." Silas held his gaze until Price swung into the saddle. The riders wheeled and headed south, the crunch of hooves fading into the cold distance. Only when they were no more than dark smudges on the horizon did Silas close the door. The woman was sitting up in bed when he returned, The coat pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were clear now, but guarded, as if weighing what she could risk telling him. "They're after you," he said simply. She nodded once. "Price. You know him?" Her lips thinned. "He knows my father." Silas eased into the chair by the bed. "They said you're the chief's daughter." Something flickered in her gaze. Not surprise, but caution. "Does that change what you've done for me?" He shook his head. "No, but it changes what I need to know." She looked toward the small window, where frost still clung to the edges of the glass. "My father leads the White Mesa people. Price and his kind have been trying to force him to sign away our river valley. Without the river, we can't live in our own land." Her fingers tightened on the coat. They thought taking me would make him yield. They tried before. This time, they nearly succeeded. Silas let the words settle, "And if they take you back, they'll send his answer in my blood." Her voice was calm, but he heard the steel in it. She'd run far and alone through a country that would kill most unarmed men in winter. That kind of will didn't come from privilege. It came from knowing what was at stake. "You can't stay here," he said finally. "They'll circle back." Her eyes met his. "I know, but I can't travel far yet." Silas leaned back, feeling the chair's legs creak under his weight. Price's words still hung in his mind, the kind of man who saw human lives as tools, to be traded and broken. He'd known that breed before. They never stopped until someone made them. "Rest for now," he told her. "We'll talk about where you go when you can walk without bleeding." She hesitated, then gave a single nod. When he stood to leave, her voice stopped him. "Why did you cover me with your coat?" Silas turned, hand resting on the doorframe. "Because you were cold." Her lips curved, just faintly, and for the first time since he'd found her, her gaze softened. Not many would have done the same. He didn't answer, just stepped out into the kitchen. But as he poured himself fresh coffee, his eyes drifted to the window again, toward the faint trail in the frost where Price's horses had passed. They'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't ask. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, sweeping down from the high ridges in long, cold breaths. Silas could smell snow in it, sharp and clean, but the weather wasn't what kept his eyes on the eastern horizon. It was the empty miles between here and the low hills. Empty miles didn't stay empty long when men like Price were sniffing a trail. He'd spent the day checking the stock, repairing a length of fence that had buckled under the frost. All the while, the image of Price's smile lingered, thin as a knife blade. Men like that didn't ride away and forget. They went to ground, gathered more teeth, and came back ready to bite. By sundown, the sky was a strip of bruised color, clouds layered over the western hills like dark wool. Silas had just stowed the tools in the barn when he heard it, the distant thump of hooves, more than the 3 or 4 from that morning. These came in rhythm, a rolling thunder that rose and fell with the ground. He crossed the yard quickly, boots biting into the frozen dirt, and stepped onto the porch. From here, the land fell away in a shallow slope, toward the creek and beyond, the road that curled toward town. Against the dimming light, a cluster of riders moved like black ink spreading across paper. 10, maybe 12. They weren't in a hurry. That was worse. Inside, he found her standing by the table, coat still wrapped around her shoulders, hair hanging loose from the braid. Her eyes flicked toward the door. "They're back," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded once. More of them this time. Her jaw tightened. "He means to take me tonight." Not without a fight, Silas said. She glanced toward the rifle leaning in the corner. You would fight for me? You don't even know my name. I know enough, he replied, crossing to the gun rack. He took down the Winchester, checked the chamber, and began laying cartridges in a neat row on the table. And I know what kind of men ride in after dark with numbers on their side. She stepped closer, voice low. If you stand with me, you stand against more than Price. His employers are men with long reach. They will not forget. Neither will I, he said simply, and went to check the shutters. The first rider reached the yard as the last light drained from the sky. Price sat tall in the saddle. The others fanned out behind him in a semicircle, horses snorting steam into the cold. Lantern lights swung from a couple of saddle horns, throwing yellow arcs over the frozen ground. "Evening, Rourke," Price called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We're going to end this polite." Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle in the crook of his arm, then turn around and ride out. Price chuckled, shaking his head. "See, I tried that once today, but then I got to thinking. You don't strike me as the sort who lies without reason, which means you lied this morning for someone worth protecting." He leaned forward in the saddle. "So I brought men to make sure you think real hard about your choices." The other riders shifted in their seats, hands near weapons. Silas saw one man on the far left, the one with the lean face of a tracker, glancing toward the windows, marking possible sight lines. "You've got no claim here," Silas said. Price's smile stayed fixed. "I've got a claim on her, and she's here." The door creaked behind Silas. He didn't turn, but he felt her step onto the porch beside him. Her chin was lifted, eyes locked on Price. "You'll never take me," she said, her voice carrying that same flint-edged calm as before. "And if you try, my father will hear of it." A murmur rippled through the men. One or two shifted uneasily, but Price only grinned wider. "Your father's half a territory away. He can't ride fast enough to matter." Silas brought the rifle to his shoulder, the movement slow and deliberate. "You're done here." The stillness deepened, the way it does before the first clap of thunder. Price studied the rifle, then the man holding it. "You won't shoot me," he said finally. "Maybe not," Silas replied, "but I'll drop the first man who takes a step." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Price gave a little nod toward the far side of the yard. One rider swung down from his horse, boots crunching on frost, and started toward the barn. Another dismounted on the opposite side, heading for the cabin's rear. Silas shifted his aim. "Last warning." The first man froze mid-step. The second hesitated, glancing back at Price. It was the woman who broke the silence. She stepped forward, the hem of Silas's coat brushing the porch boards, and raised her voice. "Price, tell your masters they've already lost. The moment you crossed this fence, you gave my people cause." Price's eyes narrowed. "Your people won't matter when you're gone. They will when they come for you," she said, "and they will come." Silas saw the flicker in his eyes then. Not fear exactly, but the quick calculation of a man considering whether the game was worth the risk. He must have decided it was because his hand dropped toward his holster. The Winchester barked before his fingers touched the grip. Splinters jumped from the porch rail inches from Price's knee, the sound echoing off the frozen hills. Horses shifted and snorted, riders swearing. "That's as close as I'll come to missin'," Silas said, levering another round home. Price's grin was gone now. "This isn't over." "No," Silas agreed. "It's just startin'." For a heartbeat, Silas thought they might rush the porch anyway, but the woman beside him hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, and something in that unflinching stare made a few of them pull at their reins. Price wheeled his horse, finally, spitting into the dirt. "Enjoy your night, Rourke. It'll be your last." They rode off into the dark, but the sound of their hoofbeats didn't fade far. Silas knew they'd make camp close enough to keep watch, close enough to move in when they thought the odds were better. Inside, he bolted the door and lit another lantern. She followed him into the kitchen, her face unreadable. "They'll be back," she said. "I know," Silas replied. She hesitated, then touched his arm. "If they take me, it's not just my life. It's my father's land, my people's future. You don't owe us that fight." He met her gaze. "You're under my roof. That's all the owing I need." For a moment, something softened in her eyes. Then she stepped back. "Then we'll need a plan." Silas glanced toward the window, where the dark pressed against the glass, like a living thing. "We'll give them a welcome they won't forget." The fire had burned low in the hearth, its glow no more than a few stubborn embers. Silas sat at the table with his Winchester laid across his knees, listening to the wind gnaw at the eaves. Outside, the night was deep and black, the kind that swallowed sound, except for the faint, restless shift of horses in the distance. Price's men hadn't gone far. She stood near the back window, the heavy coat still around her shoulders, staring out into the dark as though she could see past the miles and into some place only she knew. For a long while, she hadn't spoken. Silas figured she was measuring the shape of her thoughts, the way a smith might check a blade's edge. Finally, she turned. "You deserve to know what you've stepped into." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. "My name is Tessa Nalin," she said, "daughter of Chief Kohana of the White Mesa people." Her voice carried none of the pride he might have expected, only the weight of fact, as if the title was more burden than boast. "I figured you were someone important," Silas said, after a beat. "Didn't know how important." She moved closer, pulling the coat tighter. "Price and the men he rides for want our river valley. The land's been ours since before the first white surveyor drove a stake into this country. The valley's the only stretch of water that doesn't dry up by midsummer. Without it, our crops fail, our herds die, our people scatter." Silas leaned forward in his chair, the rifle stock cool beneath his palms. "Price said taking you would make your father yield." She nodded. "They believe holding me means holding him, but my father will not sign. He'd let them kill me first." Her eyes met his. "They intend to make that happen in a way that looks like someone else's crime. Bandits, maybe a rival tribe. That way, the valley falls without a bullet fired at the men truly behind it." Silas considered that in silence. He'd seen it before, land changing hands on paper, while the real blood spilled somewhere out of sight. "What happened before you got here?" he asked. "I was in the trading post at Laramie Crossing, meeting a courier from my father. Price came with 2 others. No one stopped them when they took me from the street." Her jaw tightened. "They rode hard through the night. I waited until we were crossing the foothills, then cut one of the hobbles when they made camp. My horse bolted, spooked theirs long enough for me to run. I've been walking and hiding since." Silas's gaze flicked to the wound in her thigh. "And that?" Her eyes turned dark. "One of them got close enough to fire. I didn't stop to see which one." The wind rattled the shutters like a warning, and both their heads turned toward the sound. It was nothing, just the night flexing its muscles, but the tension stayed in the air. You could still slip out. She said quietly, "They want me, not you. They'd let you live if you give me up." Silas shook his head once. "Not my way. You're here, under my roof. That's as good as blood." Her expression shifted, just enough for him to see something behind the guard she kept. Few would say that now. Silas stood, moving to the shelf where a worn map was pinned under a horseshoe nail. He studied the lines by lamplight, tracing the path from his ranch to the White Mesa lands in the south. "If we can get you to the canyon mouth, your people could meet you there." She nodded. "If the message reached them, I left signs along my path, but Price's men may have covered them." Silas tapped the map. "We'll have to get you out without them knowing. They'll be watching the road." She stepped closer to the table. "You said, 'we.'" He glanced at her. "I'm not letting you walk into the dark alone." For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of the fire dying. Then she said, "If my people come, they will honor you. If we fail." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. A sudden crunch outside cut through the room. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, on the frozen ground. Silas crossed to the window, careful not to let his shadow show in the lamplight. One rider had come forward from the dark, stopping a dozen yards from the porch. Price's voice floated in, steady and smug. "Rourke, I'll give you one chance. Send her out now and we ride away. Keep her, and you'll both be corpses by morning." Silas stepped into the doorway, rifle loose in his hands. "I told you this afternoon, she's not here for you to take. She's not here for you to keep, either," Price said, his breath misting in the cold. "You don't know what she is." "She told me," Silas replied. That drew a pause, then a chuckle. "Then you know she's worth more than this patch of dirt you call a ranch. Sell her to me, and I'll see you live well." Silas's voice dropped low. "You ever think how small a man has to be to talk about a woman like she's cattle?" Price's smile thinned. "Small enough to get rich while the big men swing for ideals. I'll have her, Rourke. The only question is whether you die, slow or quick." The rider turned his horse without waiting for an answer and melted back into the dark. Somewhere beyond, Silas heard low voices, the sound of men shifting in the cold, waiting for their moment. He shut the door, bolting it hard. "They'll come before dawn," he said. Tessa met his eyes. "Then we make them regret it." Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need the high ground, and I've got a few tricks in the barn." She arched an eyebrow. "Old habits from an old life," he said, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Men like Price think they're hunting you. Tomorrow they'll find out they were the quarry all along." Tessa held his gaze. "If we live, my father will know what you did." "Don't care if he does," Silas replied, turning toward the back room where the rifles were stored. "I care if you do." Outside, the wind dropped suddenly, leaving the night brittle and still. Somewhere beyond the dark, men shifted in their saddles, unaware that the ground they camped on would soon be their undoing. And in the quiet cabin, a wounded woman and a lone rancher began laying plans that would decide not just the fate of one life, but the line between freedom and surrender for an entire people. The temperature dropped fast after midnight. Frost crawled along the porch rail, silvering the boards under the lantern glow. Silas moved through the barn in the dark, hands working from memory, checking rifle sights, cutting lengths of rawhide, gathering the tools and tricks he'd promised Tessa. He could feel her presence just outside the stall, quiet but watchful, like a hawk on a branch. "They'll come from the east," he said without looking up. The creek bed gives them cover until they're close. She stepped into the dim light, spilling from a crack in the wall. And you want the high ground. That ridge above the barn. He nodded toward the dark line of earth, silhouetted against the faint glow of the sky. From there, we can see their lanterns without showing ourselves. But first, we make sure they don't get there whole. He held up a coil of thin wire, trip lines, low enough to take a man off his feet if he's not looking, high enough to rip a horse's shins if he charges blind. She didn't flinch. And the rest? Lanterns in the drawer, hung on poles. From a distance, looks like we've got twice the numbers. He glanced at her. Fear does half the work before a bullet's ever fired. They worked in silence, their breath turning white in the cold. Silas strung wires between low brush along the slope, his fingers numb through the gloves. Tessa carried the lanterns, hanging them at irregular heights, so no two looked the same. Each time their paths crossed, she met his eyes briefly. Wordless acknowledgement that this was more than a fight for survival. It was a message to men like Price. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, faint orange, bleeding into the dark, the ground was set. Silas crouched beside Tessa at the crest of the ridge, their rifles laid across a spread blanket. Below, the valley lay still, the creek a black thread winding through frost. The campfires of Price's men burned low, little orange teeth in the shadows. "They'll move soon," Silas murmured. "Cold wakes a man quicker than hunger." Right on cue, the camp stirred. Dark shapes rose from bedrolls, stamping the stiffness from their legs. A few bent to check their rifles. Price emerged last, his breath steaming as he surveyed the slope toward the ranch. He spoke to two men who broke off and began circling wide toward the creek bed. "They'll try to flank," Tessa said quietly. "They'll hit the trip lines in the scrub before they get far." Silas eased the rifle stock into his shoulder, sighting along the barrel. The first of the riders started up the slope, directly toward the barn. Behind them, others moved to spread out, just as he'd guessed. In the weak light, the hanging lanterns looked like men shifting in position. A few of Price's riders hesitated, gesturing toward them, uncertain how many they faced. That hesitation was enough. Silas's first shot cracked across the valley, the sound rolling off the ridges. One rider jerked sideways in the saddle, tumbling into the frost. Before the others could react, Tessa fired, her bullet splintering the fence post, inches from another man's leg. Horses squealed, men swore, and the slow, methodical climb turned into chaos. Price shouted for order, wheeling his horse toward the ridge. "Hold your ground! They're bluffing!" "Good," Silas muttered. "Let him believe it." Below, two men on foot hit the first trip line, sprawling hard into the brush. One didn't get up. The other scrambled to his knees, only to be thrown back as Tessa's second shot rang out. The rest of the riders were angling toward the lantern glow now, trying to count shadows. From their vantage, it must have looked like a small army holding the ridge. Silas let another shot go, dropping a man who'd tried to dash between cover. "They're bunching," Tessa observed. "That's when mistakes happen." Price seemed to realize the same thing. He barked a sharp order, and half the men began pulling back toward the creek, dragging the wounded. The others laid down cover fire, bullets snapping through the brush around Silas and Tessa. Splinters jumped from the log they crouched behind. Silas waited for a lull, then fired at the closest flash of movement. The man went down hard, his rifle skidding away. Price cursed loud enough to carry, spurring his horse toward the retreating group. "They'll regroup," Silas said, working the lever smoothly. "But they've lost the element of surprise. They'll have to come straight up now." The next charge came quick. A tight knot of riders pushing hard for the barn, heads low, guns up. They were almost on the first trip wire before one of the horses went down screaming, sending two more into a tangle. The rest pulled up short, firing wildly toward the ridge. Silas dropped another man, felt the recoil bite into his shoulder, and shifted position. Tessa stayed steady, her shots measured, each one forcing the riders to break formation again. Below, Price hauled a man out from under his pinned horse, slapping him toward the creek. He looked up at the ridge then, and even from this distance, Silas could see the set of his jaw. This wasn't going to end in a quick retreat. Price wanted blood. "They'll come again," Tessa said. "Let them," Silas replied, his voice low, calm. "Every time they do, they lose more men." But there was no gloating in it, only the steady calculation of a man who knew the ground under his boots better than the men trying to take it. For the next 20 minutes, the valley echoed with the staccato rhythm of rifle fire, the whinny of frightened horses, and the bark of Price's orders. Each push ended the same, men sprawled in the frost, the survivors sliding back toward the creek to catch their breath. Finally, Price pulled his men into a rough half-circle at the base of the slope. Even without a spyglass, Silas could see the frustration in the set of his shoulders. The man wasn't used to being held at bay by 2 rifles and a handful of tricks. "You think they'll quit?" Tessa asked. Silas shook his head. "Not him. He'll wait for a crack, and when he finds it, he'll push everything through." The sun was lifting over the far ridge now, lighting the frost in a pale shimmer. From the creek bed, Price raised an arm, signaling. A lone rider broke from the group, galloping hard back toward the distant hills. "Messenger," Silas guessed. "He's calling for more." Tessa's fingers tightened on the rifle. "Then we finish this before they come." He looked at her, reading the resolve in her eyes, then nodded once. "Before they come." Below, the men were mounting again, pulling tighter into formation. Price had abandoned the creeping approach. This time, it would be all or nothing, straight up the slope into the teeth of whatever waited. Silas checked his cartridges, the click of brass on wood sharp in the cold air. "Stay low, pick the lead riders, break their front, and the rest will fold." Tessa settled beside him, the sun glinting off the barrel of her rifle. "Let's make them remember this valley." As the first hoof struck the slope, and the charge began, the frost seemed to hold its breath, and on the ridge above, 2 figures waited, silent, steady, and ready to turn the narrow spine of land into the line where Price's ambition would end. The riders came fast this time, snow and frost bursting under pounding hooves, Price at their head, like a dark spear point aimed straight at the ridge. Silas and Tessa rose together, a rifles steady, the morning light catching in their eyes. The first shots cracked, echoing through the valley. 2 riders peeled away, one clutching his shoulder, the other hanging low over his horse's neck. The charge faltered for a breath, but Price drove them on with a yell, waving his revolver overhead. "They're coming straight through," Silas said, levering another round. "Then we break them here." Tessa's voice was ice. A third shot from her rifle caught a man high in the chest, tumbling him backward out of the saddle. Horses screamed, men cursed, but the press behind kept them climbing. In another few seconds, they'd be close enough to fire uphill in earnest. Silas aimed low, striking a lead horse in the leg. It crumpled, rolling its rider into the frost, and the knot of riders behind swerved sharply to avoid the wreck. The slope was chaos, shouting, clattering hooves, the wild ring of steel on rock where horses slipped. But Price was still coming, cutting a zigzag up the slope, using what cover there was. Silas felt the edge of urgency now. They could bleed his force, but not stop them all. If Price got close enough with numbers intact, the ridge would be overrun. Then Tessa's head jerked, her gaze snapping toward the far horizon. Look. At first, Silas thought it was dust, an odd sight after frost, but then the shapes resolved. Riders, dozens of them, their horses cresting the rise in perfect line. The morning sun struck the feathers in their hair, the polished wood of their lances. "Your people?" Silas asked. Tessa's eyes stayed on the lead rider. "My father." The sound hit next, a low, rising cry that split the air like a blade, echoing from ridge to ridge. It rolled over the valley, and for the first time that morning, Price's men hesitated, heads turning toward the sound. The Apache war party poured down the far slope, moving with the fluid certainty of hunters who knew exactly how the ground would fold under their prey. At their head rode an older man, straight-backed despite the years, his long hair bound with eagle feathers that streamed behind him in the wind. "That's Chief Kohana," Tessa said softly. Silas saw the way the man's presence alone seemed to shift the ground under Price's men. The charge faltered completely now, riders reining in mid-slope, some twisting in the saddle as if ready to flee. Price wheeled his horse, scanning the oncoming force, and for the first time, Silas caught a flash of something new in his face. Uncertainty. The Apache came on without breaking pace, spreading into a wide crescent that curved around the base of the slope, cutting off Price's retreat to the creek. The sound of their horses was like distant thunder, their war cries cutting the cold air into ribbons. "Hold your fire," Silas told Tessa, lowering his rifle. "This fight just changed." Price barked orders, but half his men were already pulling back, looking for a gap that wasn't there. The Apache line tightened, closing like a noose. Chief Kohana reined in at the center, his horse stamping, steam billowing from its nostrils. His eyes swept the slope until they found Tessa. Even from a distance, Silas saw the flicker of relief, quickly masked by the steel of command. Tessa stepped into the open, the coat falling back to reveal her tribal dress beneath, torn and stained but unmistakable. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's gaze, and raised her rifle in salute. The chief's voice carried across the distance, deep and clear. "Price, you ride on my land with guns drawn and blood on your hands. You will leave it now, or leave it forever." Price tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "You've got no authority over me, old man." Kohana's expression didn't change. "I have authority over what happens to trespassers on White Mesa land, and you have the bad luck to be one." One of Price's men hissed something in his ear, but Price shook him off, still staring up at the ridge where Silas stood with Tessa. "This isn't over," he shouted. Kohana's voice dropped low, the kind of tone that made men lean forward just to hear, and made them wish they hadn't. "It is for you." He lifted one hand, and in unison, a dozen Apache bows came up, arrows notched, the line perfectly still but humming with intent. Price's horse shifted under him. His gaze flicked from the ridge to the tightening crescent of warriors. The math was no longer in his favor. With a sharp yank on the reins, he turned his mount, spurring it hard toward the gap Kohana deliberately left at the far edge of the line. His men followed in a ragged cluster, no longer a fighting force but prey, allowed to escape. They vanished toward the hills, their hoofbeats fading into the cold. The Apache didn't pursue. This was a dismissal, not a chase. Silas exhaled, lowering his rifle. Tessa's shoulders sagged for the first time since he'd found her by the fence. Kohana dismounted at the base of the slope and climbed the last few yards on foot, his steps deliberate, his presence filling the space like the steady rise of a drumbeat. Silas stood to meet him. The chief stopped a few paces away, his dark eyes sharp as a hawk's. "You sheltered my daughter." It wasn't a question. Silas nodded. "Found her half frozen. I don't let trouble walk past my gate when it can be helped." Kohana studied him for a long moment, then turned to Tessa. "You were hurt?" She shook her head. "Not badly. I would not be standing here without him." The chief's gaze returned to Silas. "You stood against Price with only your rifle and your ground. That will not be forgotten." Silas shifted slightly under the weight of the man's stare. "I didn't do it for thanks." "Which is why you'll have it," Kohana said, and there was something in his tone that made the words feel like more than courtesy. It was a promise. He looked back toward his warriors, giving a short gesture. They began to melt away into the valley, disappearing into the folds of the land as easily as they had arrived. Only a handful remained, keeping a watchful perimeter while the chief spoke with his daughter in low, urgent tones. Silas stepped back, giving them space. He looked out over the valley, where the frost was already beginning to soften in the growing light. Price would be back, maybe not himself, but in some other form. Men like him didn't give up a grudge. But now, Silas wasn't the only one with skin in the game. When Kohana turned back, his expression was unreadable. "We will escort my daughter home. You may ride with us if you wish, or you may stay here and prepare for when they try again." Silas glanced at Tessa, saw the faintest ghost of a smile there. "I reckon I'll see you to the canyon mouth. After that I've got fences to mend." Kohana inclined his head once. "Then we leave at first light tomorrow. Tonight you rest in the knowledge that the land remembers those who stand for it." The chief walked back to his horse, swinging into the saddle with a grace that belied his years. His warriors shifted into formation, their presence still wrapping the valley in a quiet kind of power. As they rode toward the ranch to make camp, Silas felt the knot between his shoulders ease just enough to breathe deeper. The fight wasn't over, not by a long mile, but the balance had shifted. Price had seen that today, and so had Silas. The night after the Apache arrived was the first in days Silas hadn't kept one ear tuned for hoofbeats. A ring of low fires dotted the ranch yard, their smoke rising straight in the still air. The warriors kept watch in quiet shifts, their silhouettes cutting strong against the flames. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh coffee and wood smoke. Tessa sat at the table, her thigh wound freshly bandaged, her posture eased for the first time since he'd found her on the frost. She cradled a tin cup between both hands, steam curling against her face. "They'll come again," she said, though her tone wasn't fearful, just certain. Silas nodded. Maybe not Price himself, but men like him don't let go of something they think's theirs, not without a push. That push came sooner than either expected. At first light, one of Kohana's scouts returned, riding hard from the east. His words in Apache were sharp, clipped, and carried through the cold morning air. Tessa translated without looking up from her father's side. Price went to town in the night, called in favors, promised payment to men with rifles and empty morals. They ride now, 30 strong. Silas set his coffee aside. How far? The scout held up 2 fingers. 2 hours, Tessa said. Kohana's voice was calm when he answered, but it carried iron. Then we meet them before they touch this land. The war party was mounted and moving within minutes, cutting east across the open plain. Silas rode with them, the leather creak of saddles and the rhythmic drum of hooves the only sounds. Tessa rode just behind her father, her rifle slung across her back, the morning sun catching in her dark hair. They found Price's reinforcements in the mouth of a narrow draw, where the land pinched riders tight between 2 rocky spines. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Kohana knew it. The warriors split in silence, half circling wide to block the exit, the rest melting into the rocks above. Silas and Tessa stayed with the chief at the center. Price's men rode in laughing, easy in their numbers, until the first Apache war cry split the air. It bounced from rock to rock, high and sharp, and the draw came alive. Riders jerked their heads upward as arrows hissed down from the ridges. Silas fired from his saddle, dropping the lead man before he'd cleared his holster. The narrow ground became chaos, horses rearing, men shouting, gunfire cracking in sharp bursts. Price wasn't with them. Silas realized this wasn't his hand directly. He'd sent others to do his work. But it didn't matter. The draw was now a trap, and there'd be no easy escape. Within minutes, half the hired guns had thrown down their rifles, hands raised. The rest tried to bull through the front, only to meet Kohana and the warriors blocking the way. One man made it close enough to swing a carbine at Silas's head. Tessa's shot dropped him before the blow landed. When the echoes faded, the ground was littered with weapons and the smell of burned powder. Those still alive stood ringed by Apache warriors, their faces pale, their bravado gone. Kohana rode forward, the horses' hooves crunching on loose stone. "Go back," he told them in clear English. "Tell Price the White Mesa do not forget. Tell him he's already lost." The prisoners scrambled to obey, limping or mounting the few horses left to them. They fled west, shadows shrinking into the sun's glare. Back at the ranch, a courier waited. One of Silas's rare visits from town. He carried a folded document stamped with the seal of the territorial marshal. "It's Price," the courier said. "Marshal's office has a warrant for his arrest. Corruption, unlawful seizure, attempted murder. Testimony from 3 of his own men." Silas's brow lifted. Quick turn of fortune. The courier grinned. "Word is, someone got to those men before Price could pay them off. Someone convinced them living was better than dying for him." His eyes flicked toward Tessa, who was standing with Kohana near the porch. By midday, Price was in irons. Kohana sent a detachment to escort the marshal's men into the hills where Price had been hiding, and by evening the news had reached every rider within a day's travel. The fight for the White Mesa Valley was over before it had begun. That night, the fires burned warmer. Kohana spoke long with Silas by the largest fire, the younger warriors listening in respectful silence. "You had no reason to help my daughter," the chief said. "No debt to my people, yet you did." Silas shrugged. Didn't sit right to leave her on the ground. Rest was just following where that led. Kohana studied him for a moment. "You'll have friends on this land from this day forward. If you ever call, the White Mesa will answer." Later, when the fires had burned down to coals, Tessa found him alone on the porch, sitting in the chair nearest the rail. She carried something folded over her arm. "You'll be leaving soon," he said. She nodded. "My father wants me home before the snows close the pass." He glanced at the bundle she held. "It's your coat," she said, and handed it to him. "The one you gave me when we first met. I think it's kept me alive twice over. Once for the cold, once for what it meant." Silas took it, the wool heavy and warm in his hands. "You could keep it." "I think," she said, her voice low, "it belongs here, waiting for the next soul who needs it." They stood in quiet for a moment, the night wind stirring her hair. Somewhere beyond the fires an owl called, low and mournful. "When you came up that ridge this morning," he said finally, "with the sun behind you, I knew Price was finished." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "It wasn't me that finished him. It was you, and the choice you made before you even knew who I was." He looked down at the coat, then back at her. "Guess we'll call it a shared thing, then." She gave a small nod, stepped back toward the light of the fire, and was gone. At dawn, the Apache war party rode out, their lines stretching across the frost. Tessa glanced back once from the rise above the ranch, lifting her hand in silent farewell. Silas raised his in return, the coat slung over one shoulder. When the last rider vanished into the hills, he turned toward the barn. There was fence to mend, stock to check, a winter to prepare for. Life went on, but now there was a thread of connection stretching from his lonely spread to the high mesas. And if trouble ever came riding out of those hills again, he knew the riders who would come down to meet it. The frost lingered longer that morning, as if the land itself wanted to hold on to the quiet. Silas stood on the porch with the coat folded over his arm, watching the sun lift above the ridges. The valley lay still, the creek winding silver through its banks, and for the first time in weeks, there was no shadow of riders on the horizon. He thought about how quickly it had all come. A half-frozen stranger on the edge of his fence line, a name that carried the weight of a people, and the kind of trouble most men would have turned away from. But trouble wasn't always something you could walk past. Sometimes it stepped over your threshold and asked you without words what kind of man you were. The coat was back where it belonged, but it didn't feel the same in his hands. It carried her warmth now, her voice, the knowledge that standing your ground could change more than one life. The ranch would be quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. Somewhere beyond those hills, allies rode who hadn't been there before, bound not by law or bargain, but by choice. And that, Silas thought, was worth more than any peace you could buy.